Okay, so I am delighted to introduce Sharon and Gary Kerham, who are dear friends and colleagues. And they are fortunate to share not only their professional lives, but also their personal lives. They are married and have 4 grown-up children. And they have been together since Brown University, right, as undergrads, and then through medical school at Harvard. And now they work together as epidemiologists. So Sharon is a physician and epidemiologist in the Channing Division of Network Medicine at Brigham and Women's Hospital and Harvard Medical School. And she, together with Gary, started this CHEERS study, which stands for Conservation of Hearing Study, where they are studying ear and hearing disorders in this really huge patient population involving over 250,000 people from 3 different cohorts who are followed longitudinally and prospectively. She is also the founding editor of the Epidemiology of Auditory and Vestibular Disorders section of the journal Ear and Hearing, and also an associate editor for the Epidemiology section of JARO, which is the Journal of the Association for Research in Otolaryngology. She served as a member of the World Health Organization expert group that developed World Health Organization Ear and Hearing Survey Handbook. And she recently launched the Channing Division of Network Medicine Health Longevity Consortium, which is focused on studying aging and healthy longevity. Gary holds a PhD in epidemiology from the Harvard School of Public Health. And I forgot to mention that Sharon has a master's degree in epidemiology as well from the same school. And Gary is one of the very few people who is both a full professor at Harvard Medical School in medicine and a full professor at the Harvard Chan School of Public Health in epidemiology. That's really exceptional. And over the last few years, he has actually been the chief medical officer of OM1, which is a healthcare data and technology company. Gary has contributed prolifically to the understanding of epidemiology of many common diseases, ranging from hypertension to kidney stones to hearing loss and tinnitus. And his focus has been on identifying modifiable risk factors. And he has had NIH funding for more than 25 years, and he served as the editor-in-chief of the Clinical Journal of the American Society of Nephrology. And he has served on numerous national and international advisory committees, including to NIH, and his trainees hold leadership positions in major academic medical institutions and public companies. So thank you so much for coming again. And now we'll hear from both of them on the new approaches and opportunities in auditory research. Thank you.
Tina, when you say all those things, it just tells me how old I am. So Sharon and I are just so happy to be here. We're going to split the talk. I'm going to talk much shorter than Sharon. I'm going to give the overview and introduction. You may ask why a nephrologist would be talking about hearing loss, as I hope you know that ear and kidney are intimately related. Many of the things that affect the ear certainly affect the kidney, but also our oldest son was born prematurely, actually has hearing loss. He's been wearing hearing aids since his official due date. He's now 35, he's doing great. So, but hearing's been a big part of our lives. So we want to talk about new approaches and opportunities in auditory research. We really hope to get you excited. We had great conversations earlier with several of the junior people in the division. So I will go ahead. I don't know how much time you want to spend on the disclosures. I do want to say I am the Chief Medical Officer of OM1. We're currently not doing anything in hearing loss, but the CEO is actually an ENT physician, so we keep hoping that soon that will happen. The whole focus has been on chronic rhinosinusitis with nasal polyps. If I hear about that one more time, I'm not going to do Dupixent. Okay. our goals, our cohorts, cheers that Tina mentioned, and then we'll go into some of the epi studies, and Sharon will be taking over from there and talk about some new approaches, work in progress, alternative assessment, analytic methods, and finally, we really want to talk about opportunities for collaboration. Sharon and I had a great conversation with Matt earlier. I will give him a special shout out soon as part of the talk, but we have worked together for several years and hoping to renew and expand that collaboration. And we're really open. We have way too much data. I hope you know there's way too much that needs to be done in ENT, particularly when it comes to hearing and tinnitus. Are we all in agreement on that? So please don't hesitate if you're thinking about ideas as we go through to let us know. Okay. Our focus on modifiable risk factors. Sharon and I both are really interested in preventing the conditions, or at least being able to slow them, particularly hearing loss and tinnitus. We have high dimensional data sets, and Sharon will be showing you about those. We want to provide insights into subtypes. We were talking before about tinnitus, and Tina was telling us about how she decided to focus on certain types of tinnitus. Matt, and Sharon talked about this. We really have to do a much better job of phenotyping it. I always look at the oncologists as the leaders in here. When we were medical school, there was lymphoma and leukemia, and you didn't really do much more than that. And now if you don't subtype it into 18 different cells, which obviously affects the clinical implications, that's what we should be doing with hearing loss with tinnitus, not the way that unfortunately we're still crudely doing it. And of course, we want to develop therapeutics if possible. We're hoping that early intervention is going to matter, but the most important thing, if you remember one thing from today, is that not everybody has to develop hearing loss. Okay, auditory dysfunction is not inevitable. We truly believe that. There's plenty of people, including my mother, fortunately, who's hearing. She's 88 and her hearing is perfect. So how can that be that some people can do that? Not everybody develops hypertension. As a nephrologist, everybody says it's inevitable. We don't believe that's inevitable. So I want to give you an overview of the resources that we have access to, and which you do as well. These are a number of different cohorts. The first is the Nurses' Health Study. This is over 120,000 people. We've been following this woman for almost 50 years now. Nurses' Health Study 2 began in 1989, almost more than 30 years from them. Nurses' Health Study 3 is more recently started. Growing Up Today study is the offspring of Nurses 2, and they're now in their 30s. And Nurses 1 and Nurses 2 are women. HPFS, the Health Professionals Follow-up Study, are 51,000 men. All these cohorts get followed by mailed or now electronic questionnaires every 1 to 2 years. We get updates in their lifestyle, behavior, health. Every 4 years, we get updates, details on their diet. These people are unbelievably dedicated. When people have certain diagnoses, and soon to be including vestibular schwannoma, we actually get the medical records and we confirm it, because not everybody that tells us they have these conditions actually do have them. And if you're interested, we work with environmental epidemiologists. We were talking a little bit before with Michelle about perhaps air pollution as some things. So we don't have medical records on everything. It's only in areas that we're considering, but certainly, for example, head and neck cancer we were talking about earlier, maybe even thyroid cancer, we might be able to get the medical records. Okay, we have a huge biorepository. Blood samples from 100,000 participants. These are stored in liquid nitrogen. We have tissue samples. We were talking about collecting tumor blocks in certain situations. We have spot urines, cheek cells, toenails, which you can measure heavy metals and other things in. More recently, we're collecting stool and oral samples. We have over 18,000 stool samples now in our Nurse Cell Study 2. And of course, I'm going to tell you about 24-hour urine collections. That's part of our kidney stone work. But we don't have everything measured on everybody, but we do have GWAS data, for example, on 40,000 of our participants. That data is already existing. So there's millions and millions of dollars worth of information that we can leverage to look at all sorts of different things. So just to give you some idea of the cohorts, again, every 2 years, this is enrollment, then we update things. This is when we get blood samples, and the blood samples have been repeated, for example, on 19,000 of these 33,000 people 10 years later. So we actually can look at change in different profiles depending on what it is that we're interested in. And the buccal cells were for DNA. And Nurses' Health Study 2, again, very similar, except one of the additional things in 2012, with Matt's help, and I'll give him another shout out in a little bit, we started doing actual longitudinal audiometry assessments. So these are done by audiologists in actual sound booths. And our male cohort, very similar. So Sharon came up with this great name, the Conservation Hearing Study. We work with a number of different groups. We've had some ENT residents that have worked through us. We have biostatisticians, bioinformatics specialists, and others. So again, we're really open and encourage other people to participate. So to tell you how we assess hearing, well, one of it is by self-report. So in order to, we can't, as much as we'd like to be able to measure hearing loss on these hundreds of thousands of people. That would kill me if I asked him to do all of that. The 300 or so that he did. So self-reported hearing turns out is actually pretty good. It's not perfect by any means, but we're actually, Sharon will show you a number of results that we found. We also have a much more detail on 50,000 people where we sent them a supplementary questionnaire. And I'll show you some details on that. But again, we have 3,700 who've had longitudinal sound with audiometry. So these are what our questions look like. This is based on something very similar that was in the NHANES National Health and Nutritional Examination Study. So again, we're able to look at comparisons with national representative data. And then in the first time we asked about their age of onset. And as you know, most people can't pinpoint it at all, but this is actually works well enough in these very large cohorts. And we'll talk about the tinnitus questions in just a little bit. But to give you some idea about the supplementary questionnaire, again, this was filled out by 50,000 of our participants, and these people are unbelievably devoted. One way is we can ask the hearing problem, so we can ask at 2 points in time, and not everybody says yes both times. We ask about what their hearing's like, has it been changed, and when they first notice a change. But we also have been very interested in hearing experience, and we were talking about this with that before about functional hearing. We have different situations. We asked about diagnoses for these individuals, and again, these are all health professionals, so they tend to be very well reported. And then lifetime noise exposure. And Sharon and I want to emphasize, hearing loss, as you all know, is not just about noise, but of course we have to capture noise. We know that it's quite relevant. This is just a snapshot of this full page on our questionnaire about how we assess noise exposure. This one is about very loud, but we also want to know about age of onset, age of exposure, and we gave people examples. We also have about impulse noise. We have about workplace versus recreational noise. So if you're interested in noise, we actually have quite a bit of detail. And then I need to talk about the CHEERS, what we call the AAA, the audiometry assessment arm. This was clinical sound with audiometry, licensed audiologists, rigorous protocols, otoscopy, tympanometry, air and bone. And we also made sure before any of this started that all the audiometers were actually calibrated. We had a little discussion that Stanford was great, but many of the sites, large academic sites, don't always calibrate their machines. So these were 19 sites that we were able to set up across the US. Several were in California. 3,700 did baseline testing, and we had 84% that repeated it 3 years later. So these are where the CHEERS testing sites were. This is Stanford. And again, I know I've said Matt's named 4 times already, but I want to say the 5th time, and I want to publicly thank him. The Stanford site not only was our biggest site, okay, so over 300 people were tested, but he did the testing on 2 consecutive Saturdays. Most of the other places, it took like over a year. They were fitting them in between the clinical slots. And this just made such a huge difference for our participants, again, who we don't pay a penny to do any of these things, other than we gave them a copy of their audiogram. But it was just a huge contribution to some of the important data that Sharon's going to show you results for in a minute. But I just want to give you one sense of change in thresholds over short periods of time. Don't get us wrong, we do believe that thresholds are important, but we don't believe it's the only part of hearing. But NIH grants, as you know, at the maximum you can get is 5 years of funding. And so when we got funding, and then we had to test all these people, and we had to do it in 3 years and get 3 years of follow-up, and how could we possibly find enough change in time? So in fact, people did change. And these were people that when we started, Sharon and I wanted them to, we were interested in early onset hearing loss. So these people told us their hearing was either excellent or very good. So this isn't people further along, but even in a 3-year period of time, a substantial proportion of them had changes in their pure tone averages at just 3 years. So which gave us enough outcomes so that we could actually look at some of the results that Sharon's going to show you. So this is going to be my last slide, give you some sense of the magnitude of the data that we have. So in our cohorts, we have over 40,000 people who have moderate or worse hearing loss. It's not that we don't care about mild hearing loss, there's just a lot of misclassification from there. But people that have moderate or worse, it's much better reported. We have tens of thousands of people with persistent tinnitus, and that means daily or almost daily. The hearing study supplemental question I told you about is more than 50,000. Then Cheers has, the audiometry has over 3,700. So I'm going to turn it over to Sharon here, and she'll tell you about more studies that we're doing, the results.
So I just want to echo Gary and just thank you so much for having us here. It is such a thrill and a pleasure to meet all of you. And I also just have to shout out your chief because we've been working with Tina for a number of years, and she is just a wonderful collaborator, a brilliant scientist. And we are looking forward to many years of continued collaboration. So now that Gary has done such a nice job telling you about our goals and about our cohorts and all of the rich data that we've already collected, I get to talk about all the exciting things that we've been able to do with these data. So I'm going to start off by just giving you a little bit of a sampling of some of the studies that we've done, some of the findings that we've had, some of the projects that we have currently underway, and also some of our things that we have in the pipeline, and see if maybe I can entice you and intrigue you. And as Gary mentioned, because we're very open to collaborations, and we really encourage anyone who has any interest to reach out to us, because we would really love to work together. There's more data than anyone can possibly crunch, and there are more important questions to be answered. So we do encourage you to reach out. So when we first launched Cheers, our primary focus was, as Gary mentioned, on the identification of potentially modifiable risk factors for hearing loss. And we had already collected substantial data on self-reported hearing and hearing-related factors. And it gave us the opportunity to look at a number of different exposures. We were able to look at lifestyle factors like BMI and waist circumference. We looked at physical activity, smoking. We had detailed information on diet. So we could look at specific nutrients. We could look at food groups. We could look at alcohol intake and overall dietary patterns. We looked at medication use. We have a wide range of medications that we collect information regularly on our patients, and also a number of different health conditions such as menopause or hypertension, kidney disease. And we recently published a paper on low bone density and osteoporosis, and Tina was actually one of our co-authors. So one of the first studies that we looked at was analgesic use and the risk of self-reported hearing loss. So why were we interested in that? Well, aspirin, acetaminophen, and NSAIDs are the three most commonly used drugs in the US. And we had previously published extensively on analgesic use and renal function. And we know there's considerable overlap with nephrotoxicity and ototoxicity. So this seemed like a really important question to address. So this is what we found in our cohort of men, the health professionals follow-up study. And just to orient you, because the next set of slides are actually going to all follow the same format, what we see along the x-axis is where we plot the level of exposure. And so in this case, our exposure was regular use of one of these analgesics. And so we define regular use as 2 or more times per week. And as you move to the right along the x-axis, we get longer duration, more years of regular use of any one of these analgesics. And on the y-axis, what we see is the multivariable adjusted relative risk for hearing loss. And what we see is compared with men who didn't use any of these analgesics regularly, men who used aspirin, which is shown here in pink, NSAIDs, which is shown here in yellow, and acetaminophen, had a higher risk for developing hearing loss. And for those who use them for longer duration, the risk was up to 33% higher. So we also looked at this in women, and here's what we found in our cohort of in the Nurses Health Study 2, that for women who, and in the women, we actually had the ability to look at how many times per week they were taking these analgesics. And we found that for ibuprofen and for acetaminophen, that compared to women who use these, either one of these medications less than once per week, the relative risk was higher with more frequent use. And the more frequently they use these analgesics, the higher the risk tended to be. So we see for example, for NSAID use, compared with women who didn't take NSAIDs regularly or use them relatively rarely, the risk for hearing loss was 24% higher. So we also had the opportunity to look at a number of different nutrients and foods, and because we have extensive high quality long-term dietary information. So not only able to look at diet We've been following our participants over time, so we're able to look at cumulative dietary intake over long periods of time. We're able to look at recent dietary intake. We're able to look at distant dietary intake, such as adolescent diet. And we're also able to look at changes of dietary intake over time. And here's just an example of one of the studies that we did along with our co-author, Tina. And we looked at vitamins and carotenoid intake. And so, for example, what we found for beta carotene intake is that compared with women in the lowest quintile of intake, those are women who had the lowest levels of carotenoid intake, women who had the highest level of beta carotene intake were actually at a substantially lower risk of developing incident hearing loss. And our findings were similar for beta cryptoxanthin, which is another carotenoid that's found in orange slush, such as pumpkin. So in addition to looking at individual nutrients, we also have the opportunity to look at foods. And here's an example of a study that we did on fish intake and the risk of hearing loss. And we saw that compared with women who rarely ate fish, eating fish 2 or more times per week was associated with a 20% lower risk of hearing loss. And we actually even looked at individual types of fish, light fish, dark fish, tuna fish, shellfish, and we found that the magnitude of the inverse associations were pretty similar. So we thought that our findings for the individual nutrients and also for the different foods were really interesting. But when it comes to public health messaging, or really even for giving dietary recommendations to an individual, for clinician giving dietary recommendations, sometimes it's more meaningful and more understandable to talk about overall dietary patterns. So we looked at some of the most commonly recommended diets, such as the Mediterranean diet, the DASH diet, the Dietary Approaches to Stop Hypertension's diet, and also the Alternative Healthy Eating Index, which is based on the US dietary guidelines. We want to see if that might be associated with the risk of hearing loss. And just to clarify, it's not that our patients, as they're filling out their questionnaires, are telling us, yes, I eat the Mediterranean diet. But what we're able to do with this encompassing collection of dietary data that we have is that we're able to look at what our participants consume over time, and then to calculate a score called the dietary adherence score that kind of gives us a sense of how closely what our participants are eating resembles one of these helpful dietary patterns. And here what we found is for the Mediterranean diet, for the DASH diet, and for the Healthy Eating Index, compared with women in quintile 1, whose diets least resembled one of these helpful dietary patterns, or say were consuming the least healthy diets, the risk for hearing loss among those who were consuming the most healthy diets was actually 30% lower. And given how common hearing loss is, actually a 30% lower risk is pretty substantial. So, as we can see, because of all the information that we collected on self-reported hearing loss and some of our findings, we were able to study associations with a lot of different kinds of risk factors. But we also were very interested in seeing can we identify associations with changes in hearing thresholds? So, for example, we wanted to know is greater adherence to one of these helpful dietary patterns associated with hearing threshold elevation in our participants, who are the subcohort of participants that Gary described as part of our Cheers AAA. And it was striking that even among our subcohort of women who were participants in the AAA, for whom we were evaluating 3-year change in hearing thresholds, that compared with women in the lowest quintile with the least healthful diets, we saw just about a 30% lower risk of hearing threshold elevation after 3 years. So we're also able to look at a number of different lifestyle factors, and there's an example of our study of physical activity and the risk of hearing loss in Nurses Health Study 2. And what we saw here was that compared with women who with the lowest levels of physical activity, greater physical activity was associated with a lower risk of hearing loss. And we even found that just even walking 2 hours a week or more was associated with a lower risk. And we're also interested in looking at hearing as a risk factor for other adverse health outcomes. Now, a hot topic these days is hearing and cognitive decline. And that's something that is, we really were interested in investigating. And one of the things that we're really interested in looking at are early changes. So we were really interested in looking to see if hearing might be associated with really early changes in cognition. And one of the measures that we look at is subjective cognitive function. And what subjective cognitive function or subjective cognitive concerns are self-perceived changes in cognition that may be apparent to an individual, even in the absence of abnormalities in formal tests of neurocognition. So what we have here is our study on hearing loss and subjective cognitive decline in men in the health professionals follow-up study. And what we found was that compared to men with no self-reported hearing loss, that men with greater degrees of hearing loss were at a substantially higher risk. And we see that men with severe hearing loss but didn't report wearing hearing aids had a 54% higher risk of subjective cognitive decline. And if you move a little bit further to the right, you see severe hearing loss with hearing aids. Even though the point estimate was somewhat moderated among the men who wore the hearing aids, that wasn't statistically significant. What's really notable here is that their risk of subjective cognitive decline was still substantially higher. And when we did the same thing in our women in the nurses' health study, our findings were strikingly similar. That we found, compared with women with no self-reported hearing loss, that the risk of subjective cognitive decline was substantially higher, with 40% higher risk among those with the most severe hearing loss. So we're also very interested in looking at identifying potentially modifiable factors for tinnitus. So I don't think I have to convince anyone here in this room that there are a lot of challenges to tinnitus research. And as epidemiologists, we really want to get a handle on the prevalence. But it's been difficult to quantify. If you look at global estimates, they're all over the board from 5% to 43%. And part of the issue is that your prevalence is dependent on your definition and how you're going to define tinnitus. And there's really no consensus on how best to define tinnitus. And if you look into the epi literature, there's 12 different ways that tinnitus is most commonly defined. So, so one of the things that we all have to come to consensus is how are we going to define tinnitus? And one of the issues is that tinnitus itself is a heterogeneous disorder, and we really haven't gotten a handle on how to distinguish subtypes. As a result, we have a lot of ideas and we have a lot of proposed mechanisms that underlie the pathophysiology, but really at the end of the day, what the underlying processes are somewhat unclear. So we really need biomarkers, and that's one of the areas that we're really focused on, seeing if we can identify some biomarkers. There are some objective measures, which are really useful in particular settings, but the tendency is that they focus on the individual impact, which is less useful for doing a large epidemiologic study because it's very individual dependent. And finding effective interventions, as everyone knows, has been a real obstacle. And part of the problem has been it's very hard to quantify the outcomes. There's a large placebo effect. And until we get better at defining our different subtypes, it's really hard to know who best to test some of these interventions in. And so we may be missing true effects if we're not selecting the right people to test them in. There are a number of animal models, and they've been very informative and really useful. But there have been some obstacles to extrapolating these results into human studies. So as I mentioned, one of our primary interests is seeing if we can identify potentially modifiable risk factors for hearing loss. And one of our most recent studies is looking at analgesic use and the risk of persistent tinnitus. It's been well documented that high dose aspirin is associated with the risk of tinnitus, but really there wasn't that much information out there on just typical doses of regular use of NSAIDs, acetaminophen, or even low dose or moderate dose aspirin. So what we found was that compared with women who used NSAIDs or acetaminophen infrequently, less than once a week or never, that greater frequency of use of either one of these analgesics was associated with a higher risk of persistent tinnitus, up to about 20% higher. But when we looked at aspirin and tinnitus, when we looked at aspirin use in tinnitus, it actually got to be a little bit more interesting or complex is that we've separated low dose and moderate dose aspirin. So if we look on the left, we see our findings for low dose aspirin. And we found that the relations differed not only by dose, but also by age group. So we didn't see an association at all among the women, the younger women and low dose aspirin. And there was maybe a slight suggestion that that frequent use of low dose aspirin might actually be associated with an inversely associated with the risk of tinnitus. But then when we looked at moderate dose aspirin and we looked among the younger women, there was a significantly 16% higher risk of developing persistent tinnitus among the frequent moderate dose aspirin users, although we didn't observe an association among our older women. So the big picture at the end of the day is that both hearing loss and tinnitus are really complex, multifactorial disorders. And it really makes sense to make use of the explosion in technology and methodology that we have available to us today to come up with some new investigational approaches to see if we can further the understanding. So what we really would like to do is more comprehensively examine the factors that influence auditory health. We'd like to develop some more multidimensional ways of exposure assessment and really expand how we define the outcomes. So what we're starting to do now is find ways to integrate numbers of different data types using such as multiomics and complex environmental data that we're collecting. We really believe that there are powerful and promising opportunities using these high dimensional data sets. So one way we're really trying to expand the way that we think about hearing loss is to come up with a more comprehensive, integrated way of thinking about it. So if we look here on the left, we've already identified a number of risk factors, dietary risk factors, lifestyle factors, medical conditions, hormone use that are associated with hearing loss, as well as we look in the middle, there are a number of health conditions and also health implications of having hearing loss. And what we'd like to do is move over to the right and see how we can integrate some of this genomic, metabolomic, microbiomic, and complex environmental exposure information that we have to get to more integratively investigate hearing loss as more of a totality, but also to broaden the way we think about hearing loss as part of hearing health itself as part of hearing aging, and also how hearing aging might be influenced by hearing health. So how can we expand the way we think about some of these our exposures? So the concept of the exposome is what really kind of is a construct that kind of encompasses the totality of the human environmental exposures that are non-genetic, beginning from conception and really preconception onwards. And what they really represent is the accumulation of all the biologic changes from a lifetime of all these complex exposures. So how can we develop some new approaches to investigate hearing loss? So building on the findings that we've previously identified for risk factors, we have a number of current investigations that are using some of these high-dimensional data sets. We're doing some metabolomic studies using GWAS data. We're trying to use machine learning. And there's additional opportunities down the pike here. We're using the information that we're going to be collecting on the microbiome, on the gut microbiome, and also the oral microbiome, and additional omics investigations. We'd really like to expand how we're looking at hearing loss as a risk factor for other adverse health outcomes, and also how healthy hearing might be a marker of healthy aging. One of the examples of studies that we have underway is in metabolomics. And for anyone who might not be familiar with metabolomics, what this is the comprehensive large-scale measurement of all the metabolites and low molecular weight molecules in any biologic specimen. So we're focusing on plasma right now, but you can do this in urine, you can do this in the CSF, you can even do it in the perilymph. So just to give you an example of how extraordinary our patient population is, not only have our participants been completing these detailed questionnaires for decades now, they've also provided us with a multitude of biologic samples, and we have tens of thousands of blood samples that have been collected that are in the freezers now. And thanks to Tina, who has enabled us to assay some of these samples and do our metabolomic studies. And here, some of this, here's an example of the Broad Institute. It's really done a lot of the pioneering work in measuring metabolomics, and it enables us to take these plasma samples and do metabolomics measurements on a multitude of metabolites, including lipids, free fatty acids, bile acids, amines, purines, pyrimidines, a whole range of metabolites. And it was one of our a doctoral student who actually, this was his doctoral thesis that he just recently completed, worked with us to conduct the first large human study in the Nurses' Health Study on the metabolomic biomarkers for hearing loss. And what we were able to do is identify 46 metabolites that were significantly associated with moderate or worse hearing loss. And we generated a metabolite group score using all 46 of these metabolites in a lasso regression. And our key finding here was that we found that the odds for moderate or severe hearing loss were 1.4 times higher for one standard deviation in the metabolite group score that we developed, and the P was highly significant. So our take home here was that we really were able to detect differences in metabolomic profiles among women with moderate to severe hearing loss compared with those with no hearing loss. So we also were able to do metabolite set enrichment analysis. And what this helped us do is actually improve our power for detecting associations, and also to kind of inform a more biologic story. And what this is we group metabolites based on biologically meaningful patterns of metabolite concentration differences according to predefined metabolite pathways. And when we use this information to develop a metabolite set enrichment score. And what that is the combined effect estimates for all these individual metabolites by those defined groups. And at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is identify metabolite classes that are associated with our outcome. And for hearing loss, we actually were able to identify both metabolites that were positively enriched, which is shown up here at the top in red. We found that triglycerides were positively enriched among those with moderate to severe hearing loss, but also some metabolite classes that were negatively enriched. And at the bottom, we see shown in green the fatty acid esters and the steroid esters. So we're also really interested in finding metabolomic biomarkers for persistent tinnitus. And as I mentioned, that's been a real challenge in tinnitus research. And so in order to do these studies, what we really wanted to do was distinguish really the extremes, just to improve our ability to detect some differences in these metabolite profiles. So we took women who reported never having tinnitus, and we selected those women who reported the most severe tinnitus. So they had their tinnitus daily and they experienced the sound all the time. Now, introduce you here to Dr. Dwana Selesnik, who is an expert in bioinformatics. And together we've been working on our metabolomic studies of persistent tinnitus. And what we found was that we investigated some individual, to see if we could find some individual metabolites and whether or not they might be associated with persistent tinnitus. And sure enough, we found several metabolites that were significantly positive associated, as well as certain metabolites that were inversely associated with tinnitus. And actually, Tina is also a co-author on this paper that's in the pipeline. And we also were looking at metabolite classes, doing the MSEA analysis, similar to the way we did it in hearing loss. And we also found that the triglycerides and the phosphatidyl ethanolamines were positively enriched among those with persistent tinnitus, while the PC plasmalogens and the LPCs and cholesterol esters were negatively enriched among those with persistent tinnitus. And then we wanted to delve further, and we thought we wanted to look to see if, well, maybe can we distinguish differences among those women who were reporting persistent tinnitus but no hearing loss versus those who were reporting persistent tinnitus in the presence of hearing loss. So if we look here in the middle column, we see those are our findings among the women who reported persistent tinnitus they were experiencing every day and hearing all the time, but they were not reporting hearing loss. And we found that there were a number of metabolites that were significantly associated in those women while not associated with those who were reporting hearing loss. And particularly, there were certain specific triglycerides and also vitamin A. And we also found certain ones that were negatively enriched that we were inversely associated, particularly these cholesterol esters. And we did the same looking at the metabolite classes to see if we can see a difference between those with persistent tinnitus with and without hearing loss. And so we found for both the triglycerides and the phosphatidylethylamines that there were certain metabolites that were significant in both, and these are possibly significantly associated in both. But when we looked in this middle column here, the women with persistent tinnitus and no hearing loss, we found that there were certain diglycerides and organic acids that were positively associated only among those with tinnitus and no hearing loss. And again, the PC plasmalogens, the LPCs and the cholesterol esters were associated among those with persistent tinnitus and no hearing loss. So now we want to integrate with some of the additional data. So we're trying to do some additional studies using multiomics approaches. And what that is, what we're hoping to do is integrate a number of different omics data types in the hope of identifying biomarkers and ultimately seeing if we can unravel some of these causal pathways. Our hope is really to discover, see if we can find that are there shared pathways and shared mechanisms, or are there distinct mechanisms among these different subgroups? Can we find ways to connect the genotype to the phenotype? And at the end of the day, we'd love to reveal some treatment targets and inform personalized treatments. And can we use some of these multiomics approaches in the clinical setting? Can we integrate this information with the EHR? Can we integrate them with some clinical decision support tools? These may be, hopefully one day very useful in diagnosis and treatment. And from our standpoint, the hope is to be able to use this towards prevention. So here's an example of one of the studies that we have underway that we're trying to combine our genomics and metabolomics data. So we're trying to answer the question, are there known polymorphisms that influence metabolism or function of a tinnitus-related factor that modify the associations with the tinnitus risk? So the example we're taking is caffeine intake. Now, caffeine is one of these, when we first did our study of caffeine intake and risk of persistent tinnitus, the most commonly held perception was that caffeine worsens tinnitus. And it turns out that we found that actually women with higher intakes with caffeine were actually at reduced risk of developing tinnitus. So working off of this, and we know that higher caffeine intake is inversely associated with incident tinnitus, we're looking at certain genetic variants that are known to influence caffeine metabolism and also coffee intake itself. And also there's a number of genetic polymorphisms that affect caffeine metabolism that have already been shown to influence CVD, cardiovascular disease, and other disease risks. And so we're looking to see if that might actually help us gain some additional insight into the caffeine tinnitus association. So finally, we're also really looking forward to using the data that we're collecting on the microbiome and seeing how that might inform the pathophysiology of auditory disorders. So as we know, the microbiome, there are multiple resident body sites. So we have the gut microbiome, but we have the oral cavity, so skin, the nares, the ear. And the gut microbiome is where we're starting our focus. And as you may know, that's about 200 times the size of the human genome. And there's all sorts of metabolites that we're detecting there. There's peptides, short-chain fatty acids, bile acids, branched-chain amino acids, you name it. And there's a number, accumulating evidence that there's microbial mediation of conditions such as anxiety. We're seeing it in drug responses and blood pressure, number of metabolic disorders, and also a number of neurodegenerative diseases, including Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease. So our question is there microbial mediation of hearing loss and tinnitus? And it's plausible because we've seen that the human microbiome influences systemic inflammation, neural inflammation, blood-brain barrier permeability, and neurotransmitter activity. Oops, just went way too fast. Sorry, I just escaped us. Almost there.
Brief review.
There you go. Okay, just to finish up some of the other projects that we have going, because one of our goals in our cohorts is to get longitudinal testing in tens of thousands of participants, and we'd love this to be as multidimensional as we already discussed with Matt. There's a lot more to measuring hearing than just looking at the thresholds. But what we'd love to do in our participants is to test their hearing in a way that they can do in the home setting, self-administered. And so what we've been conducting is a number of feasibility and validation studies. We've been looking at tablet-based audiometers, such as the shoebox audiometer. We use smartphone-based using the Hear Test audiometer, but it's actually really expensive and logistically challenging to be sending iPads to people back and forth and having them ship them back, and also, even to send a smartphone and calibrated headphones. We're limited on the number. We want to do this with tens of thousands of people in each of our cohorts. So we've been looking at downloadable apps. So Decibel Therapeutics is a startup in Boston that we've been working with them to see if we can develop an app. But one of the problems that we've been finding also is that there really isn't a standardized method to validate the performance of some of these different methods. And we've been working with our colleague, Dr. Merlin Wang, who's a biostatistician at the Channing at Brigham. And one of the studies that we've been doing is seeing, how might we be able to advance the methods and see, can we come up with some recommended standardized validation methods? There's been an explosion of remote audiometry tools out there. Most of them are not validated, and the published validation studies that are out there are sort of the Wild West of methods. So it's really hard to compare one remote assessment to another remote assessment. So if we can come up with one standardized way to validate all of them, it would be really particularly useful. We also are trying to come up with some new analytic approaches for using audiometric data itself, because in the many of the traditional studies are based on either a 3 or a 4 frequency PTA, and there's so much more information available in the audiogram that isn't being taken advantage of, and even between the two ears. So developing new methods for that, and also to see if we can develop some machine learning methods to evaluate the audiogram information, and also seeing if we might be able to identify some audiometric phenotypes, even using the shape of the audiogram itself. So there's a lot of exciting work that's being done. So as we mentioned, there are so many opportunities for collaboration. We really encourage folks to reach out, to give you a sense of the resources that we have in our 3 cohorts, nurses 1, 2, and the health professionals. We have GWAS data. We have DNA available on over 100,000 people. We have stored blood. We have stored urine. We have all this metabolomics information. We have toenails and stool. We also have multisensory information. So if people are interested in hearing and vision, hearing and smell, or even just multisensory loss as part of even healthy longevity and healthy aging. And as Gary mentioned, we have the formal longitudinal audiology assessments. And we also have 2 other cohorts that I'd love to tell you about. Is the GUTS cohort, which is really kind of cool because that's a growing up to date study, and that's about 14,000 men and women currently aged 20 to 32 years, but we've been following them since pre-adolescence, began in 1996. And these are the offspring of the Nurses Health Study 2 participants. So we have the multi-generational aspect there. And we also have the Nurses Health Study 3, which is the enrollment is ongoing. So currently we're about 50,000 participants. This is men and women. They are younger, 20 to 45. This was begun in 2010. This is actually a more diverse cohort. So this is also another, and we have been collecting information on hearing loss and tinnitus in both the GUTS and the Nurses Health Study cohorts. So that's a little bit about us, and just want to open up the floor if there's any questions that anyone has to have or want to hear more about anything that we've shared. It was a lot of information, but you want to come on up?
Thank you for your fantastic presentation. It's really thought-provoking. We have audience here and also via Zoom. And Nirvikalpa, you can also tell us if there are any questions from the audience, right? Because, I mean, from the remote audience.
I'm Zara Patel. Nice to meet you. I'm one of the rhinologists here. So this question will probably more reflect my vague epidemiology understanding than anything else. But when you do these studies and you showed us so many nice curves of correlation between, something, beta carotene and this or anything else in that, how do you control for these other hundreds of things that are affecting hearing? Because that's what you started with, right? All these hundreds of things affect hearing. And when we're running a study, we want to try to always make sure that we're controlling for anything that we can think of that would affect our results. So are you truly able to control for all those other hundreds of things?
Well, actually, it's one of the strengths of our cohorts is that we have been collecting this wealth of information over time, and that's actually one of the main focuses of what we do is how can you adjust for all these other factors, since that's what we do. We identify purported risk factors for hearing loss, reported things that might be associated with the exposure. So now if it's in order for this to be a confounder, it has to be associated with both the exposure and the outcome that we're interested in. And we do adjust for all the factors that we have the information on, and yeah, at the same time recognizing that we can't measure everything. And so it's not going to be perfect, but another thing that we can do is because we have multiple cohorts, we can examine whatever study we're conducting in one cohort, we then try to replicate in the other cohort to see if our findings are robust, if they're consistent between the different cohorts. But it's a very good point. We can't control for everything. Actually, that's one of the things that is strengths of what we do have is that we have this longitudinal, highly detailed information that we really can adjust very well for many of these factors.
Amazing. Can I ask you one other question? I'm just curious, have you been able to see any, like as you're tracking these people over time and some of these risk factors, for example, like diet and lifestyle, if people change their diet and lifestyle, are they able to reverse that, like hearing loss association? If their diet and lifestyle improves, it like was terrible and then improves. I'm asking for myself. Did you see any correlation going the opposite way?
That's actually really interesting. So there's one thing that we haven't investigated is change in hearing over time. So we haven't figured out how to reverse hearing loss. But what we can do is look to see if because what we're looking at is relative risk. So what is your risk of developing something over time? So we can look at the change in that over time and see if your risk for hearing loss. And so, and maybe a good example of this is actually a study that we did on smoking and risk of hearing loss and smoking cessation. And what we did find that, the number of pack years, the more pack years of smoking was associated with a higher risk of hearing loss, but we also found that time since smoking cessation, the magnitude of the elevated risk tended to go down. So we can look, that's one of the, depending on which cohort we've been looking at, we've been following our participants for 20 or 30 years, and every 2 years we're updating all of this information. Diet is every 4 years, but we can look at changes over time. And because we're using survival analysis, so in most of our studies, we didn't mention, but we use Cox proportional hazards. And so we're measuring it in the change, we're able to assess their changes in risk over time. Does that answer your question?
Yes, definitely. Thank you.
But we haven't done that yet, but it's a really good suggestion to look at it. Well, hearing, we're not sure. We have some people as candidates. They say it's gone away. So that is something that's high on our list to do, is to see, is there something that those people change You know, when we see changes on the growth scale, we're assessing things every year. So it's not like one day, but certainly something we need to look at.
I'm more of a general laryngologist. So I actually have a question regarding the slide that you showed, looking at cognition and hearing aids with and without, hearing loss without, with and without hearing aids. And it looked like, there was a trend towards a decrease in the risk of maybe decline with hearing aids when it was overlap to 95% confidence intervals. I was wondering, did you try doing a sub-analysis where you set no hearing aid as the reference? Because sometimes if there's a huge difference between your reference and the two groups, you might not be able to detect the small difference between those.
It's actually a really great question, and yes, we actually cut it a number of different ways because I was actually, as you are raising the point, that's the question of the moment.
Yeah.
Is that, and one thing I should, a caveat on that is that our hearing aid information among the men isn't measured great. So, we didn't want to make more of the finding than what we had. So I'm not sure, given the data and the way that it was collected, that we can really answer that question definitively.
But we haven't,
That's a good point.
we just asked in the cohort, we hadn't asked previously, so maybe in 2 years we can tell you a little bit more.
Yeah, so we actually, as Gary mentioned, not only do we have more detailed information that we're now collecting in the women, but we also have a sub-cohort of those women who are undergoing repeated neurocognitive testing. So there's something called the Cogstate grief battery, which is something they can self-administer to themselves on the computer, and it is computer-based, so it's not. It's not auditory based, because that's actually one of the issues that's come up with a number of the studies that have been looking at hearing and cognition, is actually performance on the neurocognitive on the test of cognition is actually influenced by hearing status. So Cogstate isn't; it's independent of hearing status, and so we will, a little bit, not too long, we'll be able to investigate this question.
Oh, thanks.
Do we have other questions? Remarks? What is it? Okay. I'm curious of all the portable ways of testing hearing, which one looks most promising for collecting data from tens of thousands of people? I know you're testing several of them, but what would you bet on at this point?
So the balance is how well the test is performing and how many tests we can get using that method. So, for example, the tablet-based, like Gary speaks to this too, is, even though it performed really well, logistically, having been the ones who are sending the iPad out to participants and having to get it back and then send it out, that it's just limiting because it was very expensive and it's also logistically challenging. So what we're really hoping to do is that's, the Decibel Hearing Lab, which was the Decibel Hearing app that it was iPhone based using the iPhone AirPods. So we didn't really have, so basically in order to participate in that validation study, all the participant had to do was own an iPhone that came with the earbuds. So that's probably the most promising in terms of, or a similar test, that's the most promising in order to be able to test tens of thousands of people. So even if the test doesn't perform as well, if we can perform it in enough people, hopefully that will, offset that. And one of the things that we've been working on with Mullen Wang is, okay, well, how can we improve the measurements using that test? So we have the women take the test twice on one day and twice the next day, or twice, repeat the test over time. And how can we get a little bit more, we can get a more stable measurement. So the one thing that we have found across the board is that the tests tend to be pretty reliable. So even if they're not as accurate, the repeatability is really good.
I'm curious, in the setting of screening so many people, certainly you might come across very abnormal audiograms that need medical attention. What kind of can be done if you detect an asymmetric hearing loss or something that should be then directed to a physician for further evaluation? What are the ethical or implications of that, or how do we go about that?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Yeah, so it's really important. Most people don't die from their hearing loss, as you know. So it's unlike some of the other screenings that we've done. We do require a plan. What we did with the audiology assessment arm is that we actually sent the audiograms back to the participants. There were some times that I actually hand wrote a comment where I suggested that they go see an ENT specialist about this. So, once we get to the 10,000 range, we'll have to see. But we will be able to automate some of these things, and I'm sure you could easily tell us an algorithm that we could write up. Right? Come on, you're a fifth year, sixth year, seventh year. I lost track of the times, but for the ones that are clear enough that they should be seen. Of course, these things are being done for research purposes, not for clinical purposes. But again, when we see something like this, because these participants are doing everything out of the goodness of their heart, if there's something that's obvious, when I did 24 urine collections and I saw things, there were certain times that we would tell them, we really encourage them to go seek medical care in a non-urgent way.
And we also have the benefit, we're working with health professionals. So in the Nurses' Health Studies, these are all registered nurses. The health professionals are optometrists, dentists, chiropractors, so they are medically savvy, and we're part of a big, way bigger than just the two of us. So there is an infrastructure because there was a number of different outcomes that information is collected on. So there is pretty well established protocols for each application.
Are there now planned approaches to analyze these huge data sets using AI?
Yeah, I'm gonna take it from Matt. Yeah.
So fortunately, the younger ENT people are always pushing the limits, so that's good. So Matt Krausen, did you work with Matt at all? So Matt, who trained at Duke in machine learning, actually has been starting to work with some of our data. It's probably too small for Matt. We thought that we had big data sets, but for some of the machine learning AI type work, it's really important. So he has started to look at it. They're actually also collaborating with Judy Dub now in South Carolina to look at some of the auditory patterns that Sharon was talking about, and we have to be the ability to do that. And if I can put on my OM1 hat for a little bit, the healthcare data and technology company I was talking about. So we have the possibility of getting hundreds of thousands of audiograms. I don't know if you know about Regent, the registry for ENT. So OM1, fortunately, again, it's because Rich Glicklick is an ENT, and we have an arrangement with the AAOHNS. Did I get that right? To use the information that's in Regent, which just really hasn't been used for research purposes yet. So we just got our first delivery of 15,000 audiograms. As you know, they'll come on PDFs, and it's hard to do research and analysis on PDFs. But again, fortunately, this comes back with Matt that there are algorithms already written that, because the audiograms are fortunately in a standardized way, that from the graph, for example, you can extract the left ear threshold at 3,000 and convert those into numbers, in addition to the other things that show up on the audiogram. So yes, and we absolutely need those. Our daughter, who recently got her doctorate in epidemiology, is teaching us about like profile analyses and other ways to try to separate new groups. So absolutely happening. Need a lot more. We need even more data. So.
Oh, that's so awesome.
But we also went.
Wow. It's becoming multi-generational.
It's not contagious for us.
Any more questions? Okay, well, thank you so much. This was fabulous.